The cold air in the old house felt heavier as the night crept on. 3 friends, Sarah, Jake, and Ellie, sat huddled on the worn-out carpet, a TV screen casting its dim glow over their faces. The usual sleepover excitement was in the air. Popcorn, blankets, and stories. They were a little too old for it, maybe, but there was something about being in a house like this one, an old family home tucked away in the woods, that felt different. Maybe it was the silence, the kind that presses against your ears, the one that makes you aware of every creak, every rustle. But they didn't say anything about it yet. It was just the 3 of them, teenagers looking for a thrill. The house itself was strange, antique furniture covered in dusty sheets, walls that seemed to sigh when the wind pushed through the cracks. It had the kind of charm that only comes with age, but it also felt too quiet, too still. Something about the place gnawed at the edges of their comfort. Sarah, the adventurous one, had been the one to suggest the sleepover at her grandmother's place. It seemed like a perfect idea at first. Away from their parents, a night to be free, away from the noise of the city. The house had character, something neither of them could deny. But as the hours passed, the charm started to feel more like a facade, and the thrill of being in an unfamiliar, older home began to wane, replaced by an uneasy sensation that none of them could shake. They tried to laugh it off, but the silence between jokes grew. Jake, sitting across from Sarah and Ellie, kept glancing toward the windows, even though there was nothing but the blackness of the woods outside. Ellie, who had been trying to keep the mood light, suddenly went still. She had been talking about something, but her voice trailed off as she stared at the window above the couch. The curtains were drawn, but the night outside had this deep, impenetrable darkness that felt wrong. It wasn't the kind of dark that made you feel small in the grand scheme of the universe. No, this was a suffocating darkness, the kind that made your skin crawl, that seemed to hide something just beyond your vision. "Sarah," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you hear that?" Sarah looked up from her phone, eyes squinting. "What do you mean?" Ellie's lips were tight. "Listen, there's something scratching. Like in the walls. It's weird, right?" Jake rolled his eyes. "Come on, Ellie, it's just the house settling. It's old." But Ellie shook her head. "No, it's not like that. It's like something is moving in there." The words hung in the air, uncomfortable, making the room feel smaller. Jake opened his mouth to say something, but the sound came again, faint but undeniable, a scraping noise, like fingernails against wood. This time, it was louder. Much louder. The 3 of them froze. "Okay, that's not normal," Jake muttered, his usual bravado now tinged with something else. He got up, walked toward the wall that seemed to be the source of the sound. He put his ear to it, his face scrunched in concentration. Sarah looked over at Ellie. The tension in the room was palpable, like they were all waiting for something to happen. It felt like the air was holding its breath. For a moment, everything was still again. No scratching, no sound, nothing. The 3 of them stared at each other. "I swear," Ellie murmured, "I'm not making this up." Jake backed away from the wall, glancing at the ceiling. "It's probably just a rat or something. Let's just—" The scratching noise came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just scratching anymore. It was something more deliberate. Something purposeful. Then there was a sound. A soft, breathy whisper, so faint that it was hard to tell if it was just the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The whispers were growing louder now, following the scrape of nails, and the words were slow, drawn out. It wasn't a language they recognized. It was almost a hiss, like someone was trying to speak but couldn't quite form the words. Sarah felt the hairs on her neck stand up, her heart thudding in her chest. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, a trick of the wind, a sound from the old pipes, but deep down she knew it wasn't. Ellie stood up, her face pale. "It's coming from the attic." The air seemed to get colder all of a sudden, the temperature dropping as if someone had opened a door to the outside world, though they hadn't. Jake was no longer laughing, his face shadowed in the dim light of the room. "This is ridiculous. We're just scaring ourselves. I'm going up." Before anyone could protest, Jake grabbed a flashlight from the side table and moved toward the attic door. It was old and creaky, with a rusted latch that made an unpleasant screeching noise as he tugged it open. The attic stairs, hidden behind a heavy wooden door in the hallway, creaked under his weight as he ascended. Ellie and Sarah stood frozen in place, fear settling in the pit of their stomachs. They heard him call down, his voice shaky. "Guys, there's something up here." Ellie's eyes widened, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean, something?" The silence was unbearable. Then came the sound of Jake scrambling down the stairs, his breathing erratic. His flashlight beam flickered, lighting up his face as he reached the bottom of the stairs. "I don't know," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. I don't know what it is." The house had gone deathly silent now. The whispers stopped. The scratching was gone. In its place, there was a low, menacing hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, vibrating through the floor. It was like the house had come alive, responding to something they couldn't see. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. A door slamming shut somewhere in the house. All three of them jumped, and their hearts thudded in their chests. Sarah's voice trembled. "We need to leave." No. But as they turned to head for the door, something else happened. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her face blanching. Her eyes were wide, staring into the hallway ahead. Ellie and Jake followed her gaze. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, tall, obscured by shadows, but undeniably there. It wasn't moving. It was just watching them. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't react, just stood frozen, waiting. The air felt thick, like it had turned to stone. A chill ran down their spines, and Sarah's heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared, melting into the shadows. None of them spoke at first. The silence was deafening. The weight of what they had just seen settled over them, heavy and oppressive. Did you see that?" Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. Jake didn't respond. He was already moving toward the door, his steps quick and panicked. He fumbled with the lock, turning the knob desperately. It wouldn't budge. The door was sealed shut. The scratching started again, louder this time, accompanied by the same whispering. But now, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the house. Inside the room. Right behind them. As they turned around, the light flickered once more, and then the whispering stopped. The house, for the first time that night, seemed completely still. They were not alone. Something was here watching them, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The moment the whispering stopped, it was like the air shifted. The entire room, the house, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sarah could feel it, the oppressive silence pressing in on her, squeezing the breath out of her lungs. The hairs on the back of her neck stood straight, every sense on high alert. She tried to move, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. Ellie, standing just behind her, was trembling, her breath shallow and rapid, and Jake was staring wide-eyed at the door, his fingers twitching, but he made no move to open it. It was as if they were all frozen in time, trapped in a moment that stretched on far too long. Then it came again, the whisper. Only this time, it was clearer, louder, and unmistakably closer. The sound of it sent a jolt of panic through Sarah's chest. She didn't know if it was her mind playing tricks on her or if it was something far worse, something real, something alive, but the words were unmistakable. It was a language she didn't recognize, a rasping, guttural noise that seemed to cut through the silence like a blade. "Did you hear that?" Ellie gasped, her voice shaking with fear. But before Sarah could respond, Jake's flashlight flickered again, casting an eerie light across the room. The beam of light bounced off the walls, illuminating the space just for a second before the darkness reclaimed the shadows. Sarah's heart was pounding now, a deafening thud in her ears. The shadows themselves seemed to sway, shifting unnaturally, as if they were alive, watching. Jake, we need to get out of here," Ellie pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no other sound, just the beating of their hearts, their breathing, and the whispering that was growing louder, growing closer. It was like something was moving inside the walls, something large, something heavy, dragging itself across the beams. Sarah could almost feel the vibrations in her bones, the low hum that seemed to reverberate through the floorboards. But Jake didn't seem to hear her. He was staring at the attic door, his eyes wide, filled with an expression Sarah couldn't place, fear mixed with something else. Curiosity, maybe. Maybe disbelief. But there was no question now. He knew that something was wrong. They all knew. "I'm going up," Jake said, his voice trembling slightly but determined. The words came out of his mouth like an order, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as the others. "No, Jake, we're not going up there," Ellie said, her voice rising with panic. She stepped forward, grabbing his arm. "There's something up there, something. I have to know," Jake interrupted, his gaze locking with hers. His expression was firm, but Sarah saw the tremor in his hand, the way his body was taut with fear, like a coiled spring about to snap. He wanted to prove it to himself, wanted to make sure it wasn't just his imagination. He needed to see it, whatever it was. Without another word, Jake pulled away from Ellie's grip and made his way to the attic door, the light from the flashlight flickering erratically as he moved. Sarah and Ellie exchanged a look, neither of them knowing what to do, but neither of them able to stop him. It felt like everything in the room was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Jake reached the door and hesitated for just a moment, his hand on the cold metal latch. The air seemed to grow heavier around him, like the house itself was trying to keep him inside. He pulled the door open with a sharp, squeaking sound that echoed through the otherwise silent house, the sound of metal against wood making Sarah's skin crawl. Slowly, Jake climbed the stairs, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing bits of old furniture and forgotten boxes as he made his way to the top. Sarah and Ellie stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching, unable to move. Ellie's face was pale, her mouth dry, and Sarah could feel her own heartbeat pulsing in her throat. The fear was rising in her chest, coiling tighter and tighter, but she didn't want to be the one to say it. She didn't want to be the one to make the suggestion they all knew was coming. Maybe we should just leave. But the thought was there, and it was growing louder with every passing second. "Jake," Sarah called out, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer. Just silence. Then, suddenly, the silence was broken by a low, rasping growl, not from the attic, but from somewhere beneath the floor. The sound was so strange, so unnatural, that Sarah couldn't even place it. It was like a deep, vibrating hum, something that rattled her bones and made her stomach turn. It was as if the house itself was alive, and something inside it was stirring, waking. She opened her mouth to say something, to warn Jake, but the words caught in her throat. She heard the attic door creak as it opened wider, and then Jake's voice, trembling but clear, "There's something. It's not. There's something up here, guys." His words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. There was a pause. A long, stretching pause as the air seemed to freeze. Then Jake screamed. It was a high, desperate scream that echoed through the entire house. It was the kind of scream that makes your blood run cold, the kind of scream that tells you something has gone terribly wrong. The kind of scream that didn't belong in a sleepover. Not in a house like this. Not anywhere. Ellie bolted toward the stairs, but Sarah caught her arm, pulling her back. "No. Wait," she hissed, panic rising in her chest. Her mind was racing, but the thought of going up there made her sick. What was up there? What had happened to Jake? The scream came again, louder this time, full of terror and pain, and Sarah couldn't hold back anymore. She ran after Ellie, who was already halfway up the stairs. They reached the top of the attic stairs just as Jake stumbled back down them, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't speak at first. He just stared at them, his body trembling uncontrollably. What happened?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's voice was hoarse, his breathing ragged. "I don't know. I don't know what it was. It was there. It was waiting." Sarah grabbed his arm, trying to steady him, but his body was rigid, like a puppet on strings, his eyes darting around the dark hallway, as if looking for something, or someone. His flashlight flickered again, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the walls, warping into shapes that made no sense. "We need to leave," Jake whispered, his voice frantic now. "Now." The sound of scratching came again, louder this time, not from the attic, but from the walls behind them. It was as if something was moving inside the walls, crawling, scraping, drawing closer. It was slow at first, but then it picked up speed, each scrape faster, more frantic. Sarah could feel it now, like the walls were closing in on them, the space around them shrinking. Ellie's face turned white as she spun toward the door. "We have to get out of here." But when they turned to leave, the door wouldn't open. The latch was stuck, the handle turning uselessly in Sarah's hand. Her heart pounded in her chest as she yanked the door harder, but it wouldn't budge. The walls were closing in, the scratching growing louder, and she felt like she couldn't breathe, like the house was swallowing them whole. Then, suddenly, the whispering returned. It was louder now, almost deafening, surrounding them on all sides. The words were clear this time. "We see you." They weren't alone. The door gave way with a violent snap, and the three of them stumbled out into the hallway. The floor beneath them felt like it was alive, shifting, groaning. And then, at the far end of the hall, something moved. Something was waiting for them. Something that had been watching them the entire time. The hallway felt unnaturally long as they stumbled into it, each step echoing too loudly against the worn floorboards. The old house had a way of distorting time and space, bending the world around them into something that felt wrong, disorienting. The walls, once simple and unremarkable, now seemed to pulse with a quiet, malignant energy. Every shadow in the corners seemed to stretch, to lean in closer, like something was hiding just beyond their line of sight. Sarah's pulse was a steady drumbeat in her ears, drowning out everything else. Ellie was just ahead of her, moving quickly, her hand pressed tightly to the wall as if the rough texture could ground her, could bring her back to some semblance of normalcy. Jake was silent beside them, his face pale, his eyes darting frantically from side to side, but he said nothing. His body was trembling, his movements jerky as if he had been shattered, piece by piece. "We need to get out," Jake finally managed, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. He had said it before, but now it held the weight of something desperate, something primal. Sarah looked at him, her own fear reflected in his eyes. She could feel the house closing in on them. The air was thick, heavy, pressing down on her chest, and no matter how many times she tried the door, it wouldn't open. The latch, once so easy to turn, now felt like it was welded shut. It wasn't the kind of thing you could explain. The house wasn't just a structure, it was alive. It was aware of them, watching them, waiting. But they had no choice. They had to keep moving. They had to escape. There was nothing else to do but push forward, toward the front door, toward freedom. But each step was like trudging through molasses. The hallway stretched endlessly before them, its oppressive darkness seeming to swallow the light. The sound of their footsteps was too loud, too harsh in the stillness, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. That whatever had been watching them, whatever had been waiting, was now at their heels. Ellie was the first to break the silence, her voice tight with panic. "We're going in circles. This doesn't make sense." She looked over her shoulder, but the hallway was empty. No figure. No shadows. Just the unsettling quiet. Sarah's stomach twisted. She didn't know what was more terrifying, the idea that something was following them or the fact that they had no idea where they were anymore. The house felt wrong, twisting, turning, rearranging itself around them. Every corner they rounded seemed familiar, yet somehow not. Every room they passed felt like it was inside their heads, like they were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Sarah's fingers brushed the wall as she moved, the cold, rough surface sending a shiver up her spine. The whispers, that soft, unintelligible murmur, had returned, growing louder again, crawling into her brain like a disease, creeping into her thoughts. She glanced at Ellie, who had stopped just ahead of her, her hand gripping her stomach as if she might be sick. Ellie's face was drawn, her eyes wide with fear. "Sarah, do you hear it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah nodded, though she didn't want to admit it. She could hear the whispers too, now louder, sharper, more distinct. They were coming from everywhere. The walls, the floorboards, the very air around them. There was no escaping it. No hiding from it. The whispering wasn't just words anymore. It was a presence, a weight pressing down on them, suffocating them. It was as though the house itself was alive, and the more they resisted, the tighter its grip on them became. Jake, who had been walking with his head down, finally looked up, his face pale and streaked with sweat. "It's coming from everywhere," he said, his voice strained, his words barely audible over the growing noise. "It's not just the walls. It's in my head." His breath hitched in his throat, his eyes wild. He was losing it, and Sarah could see it. He was breaking apart. "I know," Sarah said, her own voice barely a whisper. "I feel it too. We need to get out. We have to." A loud crash interrupted her. It came from above, from the attic. The sound of something heavy being thrown against the floor, something large. It was followed by a loud, echoing thud, then silence. Absolute, eerie silence. Ellie jumped, her eyes wide. What the hell was that? Sarah didn't have an answer. She couldn't explain it. The fear coursing through her was so thick it made her stomach turn, but still, she forced herself to keep moving. There was no time to waste. They had to leave. Whatever was upstairs, whatever was in the attic, was far too dangerous to even consider. They reached the end of the hallway, where the stairs to the front door should have been. But when they got there, they found only a wall. A solid, unbroken wall where there had once been a staircase. It wasn't just the wall that was wrong, it was the very structure of the house. The space between them and the door was gone, as if the house had swallowed it whole. Ellie reached out a trembling hand and pressed it against the smooth surface, feeling for a crack, for a way through. But there was nothing. "No," Jake murmured, his voice breaking. "It can't be. It's impossible. We just passed this. We were right here." He turned to Sarah, his eyes desperate, pleading. "This isn't real. None of this is real." Sarah didn't know how to respond. She didn't know if the house was playing tricks on them or if they had somehow slipped into another dimension, but she knew one thing for sure: they were trapped. There was no way out. No way to escape. Ellie's breath was shallow, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. "We need to get out of here now. This place isn't what we thought it was. It's alive. She stopped, her voice catching in her throat. "It's watching us." The realization hit Sarah like a cold wave, and her blood ran ice-cold in her veins. She turned slowly, her heart racing. She hadn't seen it before, but now it was clear. The shadow in the corner of the room was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but it was there. She could see it now, something tall, humanoid, its shape barely visible in the low light. It stood motionless, its head tilted just slightly, as if studying them, as if waiting for something. Waiting for them. Jake's breath caught in his throat, his eyes locking onto the figure. He took a step back, his whole body tense. "What is that?" he breathed, barely able to keep his voice steady. Ellie's face went slack with fear, her mouth open but no sound coming out. For a moment, none of them moved. The room seemed to stretch in every direction, the shadows pulling at the edges of their vision, making everything feel distant, out of reach. The figure was growing larger, more defined, and Sarah could feel its presence in the pit of her stomach, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just in the room with them, it was in their heads too, crawling under their skin, making them question everything. It was as if it was pulling their thoughts into its web, manipulating them, bending them to its will. Suddenly, the figure lurched forward, moving faster than anything that large should have been able to. It was impossibly fast, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it lunged at them. A sharp scream escaped from Sarah's throat as she stumbled backward, her legs buckling beneath her. Jake and Ellie were already moving, running, but the thing behind them, whatever it was closing in, faster, closer, until it was all-consuming. Sarah didn't know how she was still standing. She didn't know what was real anymore or what was a nightmare. All she knew was that they had to escape. They had to survive. The figure's twisted form blurred in the darkness as she turned to run, but when she glanced over her shoulder, it was still there. Still coming. And there was no way out. The air in the hallway felt thick, suffocating, and every breath Sarah took seemed to drag heavier than the last. It was as if the house was feeding off their fear, growing more oppressive with each passing second. She could feel it, the walls closing in, the very structure of the house bending to something darker, something malevolent. The strange figure that had appeared in the corner of the room was still there, or at least she thought it was. In the dim light, it was hard to make out its shape clearly, just a distorted silhouette standing motionless, as if it were studying them, waiting. There was no sound, no movement, just the oppressive weight of its presence, the sense that it wasn't just in the room with them but in their heads, gnawing at the edges of their sanity. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, and her legs felt weak, almost as if she might collapse from the pressure of it all. The figure's shape seemed to distort slightly with the flicker of the flashlight, stretching unnaturally as if the light itself was warping around it. "We have to go," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with panic. The words barely escaped her lips, swallowed by the silence that enveloped the house. Ellie was frozen, staring wide-eyed at the figure in front of them, her face pale, her hands trembling at her sides. Jake wasn't much better. He was moving, but in slow, jerky motions, like he was trying to pull himself away from a nightmare, but couldn't quite escape it. There was a desperation in his eyes, a wildness that Sarah hadn't seen before, not even when the whispers first started or when they heard that awful sound from the attic. This was different. This was something deeper, something that had a grip on them that was impossible to shake. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure shifted. It didn't move like a human, or even a creature. It moved like something made of shadow and smoke, like it was not supposed to exist, and yet there it was, drawing closer with every heartbeat. The air around them grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that Sarah's breath became visible in the chill. Ellie gasped, her eyes wide with terror. It's not real," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of Sarah's own heartbeat. But it was real. Sarah knew it. She could feel it in the way the house creaked around them, in the way the shadows stretched unnaturally, warping into shapes that didn't belong. She could feel it in the back of her throat, that cold, suffocating feeling that made every instinct scream at her to run, to get out, to escape before it was too late. But there was no escape. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a prison. The trap, the walls, the floors, the very foundation beneath them, they were all part of something bigger, something alive, and they were caught in its web. Jake's breath hitched as the figure drew closer, and he took a step back, his foot slipping slightly on the floorboards. Ellie reached out instinctively, grabbing his arm, but Jake didn't seem to notice. He was staring at the figure, his expression a mix of fear and confusion. "What is that?" he asked, his voice trembling. But he didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need to. They all knew. Sarah's stomach churned, the dread building inside her until she could hardly breathe. She couldn't understand it. She didn't want to understand it. But it was happening. The house, the whispers, the figure, it was all part of something bigger, something they didn't have the strength to face. The figure wasn't just a shadow. It was more than that. It was alive, and it was waiting for them to make a mistake. To show weakness. It was patient. It knew how to make them fear. With a sudden, sharp movement, the figure lunged forward, faster than anything should be able to move. The sound of its movement was like the scraping of nails against wood, sharp and jagged, ripping through the air. Ellie screamed, but it was a muted sound, like the fear had swallowed her voice. Sarah froze. She didn't know where to go. She couldn't think. It was like her body was locked in place, her mind unable to process the reality of what was happening. Her heart hammered in her chest, a wild, frantic rhythm that didn't match the stillness of the house. The figure was too fast, too unnatural. It moved like it didn't belong in this world, like it had slipped through a crack in reality itself. Jake stumbled backward, his body jerking with the force of his fear. "We need to leave," he screamed, but it wasn't the same Jake anymore. His voice was broken, filled with terror. He wasn't even looking at them anymore. He was looking at the figure, his eyes wide with disbelief. "This isn't real," he muttered to himself, over and over again, as if repeating the words might make it true. But it wasn't true. None of it was. And they all knew it. Ellie tried to move, but her feet wouldn't obey. She was frozen, unable to tear her gaze away from the figure that was getting closer, its shape twisting in and out of the shadows, Never fully solid, always flickering. Sarah wanted to scream, but the sound was caught in her throat. She couldn't breathe. The air was too thick. The weight of the house was pressing down on her chest, making it impossible to think, impossible to escape. Her vision blurred for a moment, and for a split second, she thought she might faint. But she couldn't. She had to stay awake. She had to stay alive. The figure moved again, faster this time, and as it did, the entire house seemed to respond. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and the windows rattled, as if the building itself were alive, shifting to accommodate the thing that was in it. And then, in the corner of Sarah's eye, she saw something else. Something even worse. The shadows in the corners of the room were shifting, moving on their own, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. Faces, distorted and monstrous, emerged from the walls, their eyes wide and hollow, their mouths gaping open in silent screams. They were watching them. Waiting. "Sarah," Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "Sarah, we have to," but Sarah didn't hear the rest of her sentence. The room was spinning. The walls were closing in. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled backward, her body trembling with fear. She was losing control. Losing herself. She could feel it. The house was pulling her in, wrapping its tendrils around her mind, around her very soul. It was taking her. Taking all of them. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The figure was gone. The shadows had receded. The whispers had ceased. For a moment, everything was still. Unnaturally still. The house had fallen silent, and the only sound was the rush of blood in Sarah's ears, the heavy, erratic rhythm of her own heartbeat. Jake was standing next to her, staring ahead with wide eyes. His hand was on his head, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, frozen in place. Ellie was breathing heavily beside them, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. Did that just happen?" Ellie asked, her voice shaking with the same fear that was gripping Sarah's heart. But Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. She didn't know what to say. The figure was gone, but it wasn't over. It was never over. The house was still alive, still watching. And they had no idea what it wanted. The silence in the house was suffocating, an unbearable weight that pressed against their chests, stealing the air from their lungs. For a moment, Sarah thought it might be over, that whatever had been watching them, stalking them through the walls, had somehow lost interest. Maybe the figure had just vanished, along with the shadows and the whispers, and they could finally leave this place, this nightmare, behind. But as her eyes flickered across the room, the creeping sense of unease did not let go. The house was still too quiet, the air too still, the light too dim. She could feel it again, this creeping sensation, the gnawing sense of something lurking just beyond her sight, just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her gaze darted to the door, then to the windows, but there was no escape. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs felt like lead, her feet cemented to the floor by a force she couldn't understand. Ellie was standing just a few feet away, her wide eyes reflecting the same fear that Sarah could feel in the pit of her stomach. Jake was beside her, but he looked no better. His face was pale, his body rigid with tension, and the way his eyes darted around the room suggested he didn't know what to expect next. But the one thing they all knew, the one thing that was undeniable, was that there was something in the house with them. Something that had been there from the beginning, watching them, waiting. The whispers started again, but this time they were different. They were more distinct, more focused, as if whatever was making the sound was getting closer, moving toward them, speaking directly to them. The sound was faint, so faint at first that Sarah wasn't sure if she was hearing it at all, but then it grew louder, clearer. Words began to form, but they weren't words in any language Sarah could understand. They were harsh, guttural, like something ancient, something primal. The tone was familiar, but it wasn't human. It felt like the words themselves were tearing through the very fabric of reality, warping the space around them. The air began to hum with a low vibration, a sound so deep and unsettling that it felt like the ground beneath their feet might crack open. Jake's breath hitched, his chest rising and falling erratically. He turned toward Sarah, his eyes wide, his voice hoarse. Do you hear that? It's not just whispers anymore. It's alive. His words caught in his throat as if he couldn't believe what he was saying, as if the very thought of it terrified him to his core. Ellie's hand shot out to grab his arm, her grip tight. Jake, stop. It's trying to get into our heads. We can't let it. Her voice was trembling, the words barely escaping her lips as she fought to keep her composure. She glanced around the room as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. And why wouldn't she? Everything about this house felt wrong, as if it had been twisted by some malevolent force, as if the walls themselves were alive with a dark energy, one that only grew stronger the longer they stayed. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry, her mouth parched. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, the weight of the thing that had been watching them from the moment they entered. The very air felt thick, as if they were walking through a fog that clouded their senses, made it impossible to think straight, to process what was happening. She could almost hear the walls themselves groaning, shifting, as if the house itself was preparing for something terrible. Suddenly, there was a crash from somewhere deeper in the house, a sound that rattled through the floors and made their hearts race. Sarah jumped, her hands shaking as she grabbed hold of the nearest piece of furniture to steady herself. Ellie gasped, her eyes wide with fear as she turned toward the source of the sound. It had come from upstairs. From the attic. Jake, Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. We need to go. We need to get out of here. It's up there. But Jake didn't respond immediately. He was still staring at the hallway, his eyes unfocused, his mind lost somewhere far away. He didn't look at Ellie. He didn't even seem to hear her. He was lost in a trance, his breath shallow, his hands twitching at his sides as if fighting some unseen force. Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. She could see it in Ellie's too. They were all caught in this place, this trap, and it was closing in on them. Ellie took a step toward the stairs, but Sarah grabbed her arm, pulling her back. No, don't go up there. We can't split up. We need to stick together. Ellie's face twisted in fear, her body shaking with anxiety. We don't have a choice. It's in the attic. It's waiting. But we don't know what it is, Sarah argued, her voice cracking. She turned toward Jake, pleading with him to snap out of it. Jake, please. We have to leave. Before it's too late. But Jake was beyond reasoning now. His eyes were unfocused, glazed over, and for a moment, it felt like he wasn't even there. As if whatever had been inside the house from the start had taken him. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and it seemed to shake something loose in Jake's mind. With a sharp inhale, he suddenly snapped back into himself, but it wasn't the same Jake. His face was pale, his eyes filled with an indescribable terror. His body was trembling, as if he couldn't control the movement of his limbs, as if something else was pushing him forward. I have to go up there, Jake muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He took a step toward the stairs, but Ellie and Sarah both moved to stop him. No, Jake. Ellie screamed. You don't understand. It's not safe. But it was too late. Jake had already moved, his feet carrying him up the stairs with a terrifying determination. His face was set in a grim expression, his steps slow but sure, as if he knew what was waiting for him but couldn't stop himself from going. It was as if the house had already claimed him, body and soul. Ellie and Sarah exchanged a look, but before either of them could act, the door to the attic slammed shut with a violent force that shook the house. The sound echoed through the halls, reverberating in their bones. The walls seemed to groan in response, as if the house was alive, responding to Jake's presence. The temperature dropped instantly, a cold that seeped into their bones, freezing them in place. What is that? Ellie gasped, her breath coming out in visible puffs as she looked around the room in panic. It's him. It's Jake. He's up there. Before she could finish her sentence, the whispering started again, louder this time, almost deafening. The walls vibrated with it, the sound rattling through their skulls like 1,000 voices crying out in unison. And then, from the attic, came a sound. A scream. Not Jake's voice. Something else. Something inhuman, something that sounded far too wrong. The sound was followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor, the screeching of metal on wood, a sound that sent chills down their spines. Ellie stumbled back, clutching her chest. No. No, we can't. We can't do this. We can't go up there. We have to leave. No. But Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't take her eyes off the attic door. It was as if something inside was calling to her, pulling her toward it, and despite everything, she felt herself moving toward it. A force beyond her control. A compulsion she couldn't fight. The door to the attic creaked, and for a brief moment, the whispering stopped. There was only silence now, heavy and thick, like the house was waiting, like it was drawing in a breath before the next part of the nightmare began. Sarah stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. And then, with a sickening certainty, she knew whatever had been watching them, whatever had been waiting for them, was no longer in the shadows. It was coming for them, and there was nowhere to hide. The silence that followed was unbearable, like a thick blanket pressing down on their chests, smothering them with the weight of uncertainty. The scream from the attic had stopped, but it wasn't comforting. It was worse. The stillness that filled the space between the three of them now was far more terrifying than any noise had been. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, that hummed with anticipation, with threat. The kind of silence that suggested something was waiting just behind the walls, just out of sight, watching them, waiting for the moment when they would let their guard down. Sarah stood frozen, her heart racing in her chest, her mind racing to catch up with the horror unfolding before her. She could still hear the sound of Jake's footsteps in her mind, the soft shuffle as he ascended the stairs, the way his body had moved with such determination. But there had been something in his eyes when he left, something empty, hollow. It had been as if the person she had known, the friend she had trusted, had already disappeared before he'd even reached the attic door. Now, only the remnants of him were left behind, but those remnants felt as if they were slipping further and further away with every passing second. Ellie was next to her, but Sarah didn't need to look to know that her friend was feeling the same terror. It was written all over her face, her wide, glassy eyes, her lips parted in silent fear. But there was something else too. A resolve. A determination to face whatever was coming, no matter how scared she was. It wasn't just fear that was driving them now. It was the need to understand what had happened, to find out why they were here and what had happened to Jake. And maybe, just maybe, to find a way out. If there even was a way out anymore. "Sarah, we can't just stand here," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words trembling with the fear that was rising like bile in her throat. But despite the tremor in her voice, there was no mistaking the urgency. "We need to find him. We need to see what's going on in that attic." She stepped forward, but her body was stiff, unwilling to move too quickly. It was as if the house itself had a way of slowing them down, of making every action feel like it was happening in slow motion, like they were trapped in some kind of dream they couldn't wake up from. Sarah wanted to scream, to argue, to beg Ellie to turn around and run, but she couldn't find the words. She couldn't find the strength to say it, even though her body was screaming it. Every fiber of her being wanted to flee, to escape the nightmare they had found themselves in. But Jake was still up there. They couldn't leave him behind. They couldn't leave anyone behind, not even if the very walls were closing in around them, pressing down with the weight of some ancient, evil presence. The temperature had dropped further, so much so that Sarah could see her breath in front of her, clouding in the icy air. It was as if the house itself was exhaling a cold, wet breath, curling around them like the fingers of a ghost reaching out from the darkness. Ellie took another step forward, her feet slow, deliberate, as if each movement took every ounce of courage she had left. Her eyes were fixed on the stairs, but Sarah could see the way her hands were shaking, the way she couldn't seem to stop glancing around, looking for something, anything, that might give her a clue as to what was really happening here. They reached the base of the stairs, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The attic door above them loomed like an impenetrable gate to a place they should never have gone. It was darker than the rest of the house, the shadows thicker, deeper, as if the attic were some kind of forbidden space. Something about it felt wrong, More wrong than anything else in the house had so far. The sound of the house settling, of the floorboards creaking, seemed to echo through the still air, amplifying the tension, making every second feel like an eternity. Ellie's voice broke the silence again, her words a mixture of determination and dread. "We have to go up there." "Jake might be," she trailed off, unable to finish her thought, but Sarah understood. She knew what Ellie meant. Jake might be gone. He might have already been taken by whatever had been lurking in the attic. But they couldn't turn back now. With one last glance at Sarah, Ellie began to climb the stairs, her footfalls tentative at first, then gaining confidence with each step. Sarah hesitated for just a moment longer, a knot of fear tight in her chest, but then she forced herself to follow. The stairs groaned under their weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. The flashlight flickered as they reached the top of the stairs, casting eerie, jittery shadows on the walls. The attic door was just ahead, standing tall and foreboding, its wooden frame scratched and weathered, as if it had been untouched for decades. As they approached, a shiver ran down Sarah's spine. The air was thick, and with each step, the sense of being watched grew stronger, more pronounced. The whispers, which had faded earlier, now returned, louder and clearer, almost deafening. The words weren't just unintelligible anymore. They were sharp, like a warning, an invitation. "Come closer. Don't turn away." Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand at attention, her instincts screaming at her to turn around, to run, to get as far away from the attic as possible. But Ellie had already reached the door. "Jake?" she called softly, her voice shaking as she reached for the doorknob. But before she could touch it, the door creaked open on its own, the sound reverberating in the narrow hallway. It was slow at first, but as it opened wider, the air grew colder, and the whispers seemed to grow louder, swirling around them like a storm. Sarah felt a chill run through her, so deep and intense that it was as if something cold was settling into her bones, wrapping itself around her heart. Ellie glanced at her, and for the first time since they had entered the house, Sarah saw fear in her eyes, real, raw fear. "Sarah, are you sure we should?" But the words died in Ellie's throat as the door creaked open fully. The attic was dark, impossibly dark, the shadows so thick that it seemed as though the space beyond was a void, an empty hole where the light from their flashlights couldn't reach. It felt as though the darkness itself was alive, a suffocating, crawling presence that wanted to consume them whole. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she felt paralyzed by the terror, by the raw, unrelenting fear that seemed to be coming from every corner of the house. But there was movement in the darkness. Something shifted, a form that was barely visible, but it was there, alive, waiting. A flash of white, Jake's shirt? The faintest outline of a figure. A shape, half hidden in the shadows, moving. Slowly, cautiously, as if it were testing them, gauging their reaction. "Jake." Ellie's voice was barely a whisper, barely audible over the humming, the buzzing sound that filled the attic. "Jake, are you okay?" And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shape vanished into the darkness. The attic fell silent once again. The whispers stopped. The shadows seemed to hold their breath. But Sarah's heart was beating louder than ever, her chest tight with fear, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. She could feel it now. They were not alone. They had never been alone. And then, from the dark, a voice. It was Jake's voice, but it was different, twisted. Like it had been pulled through some distortion, some horrible, otherworldly force. "Get up before it's too late," he whispered. The words were ragged, filled with desperation, but they sounded like a warning, a plea for them to leave, to escape. Before Sarah could react, before Ellie could move, the figure appeared again. This time, it was clearer, closer. And it wasn't Jake anymore. Not completely. Whatever had taken him, whatever had claimed his body, was standing before them. It was no longer human. Not in any way Sarah could understand. The thing before them was something else entirely, something wrong, something twisted by the house itself. And it was staring at them with eyes that weren't his. Ellie screamed. Ellie's scream cut through the stillness of the attic, but it was swallowed almost immediately by the thick, suffocating darkness. Sarah felt the sound vibrate through her chest, A shockwave of terror that rippled outward, making every inch of her body tense with the kind of fear that paralyzed the mind. Her mouth went dry, her heart stuttered in her chest, and for a split second she couldn't even move, frozen in place, as if the air itself had turned to stone, holding her captive. She wanted to scream too, wanted to cry out, to beg for help, but the words didn't come. The figure in front of them had shattered the very reality of their situation, and it felt like all sense of time, space, and reason had slipped away. The thing standing before them, Jake or whatever was left of him, was not the person they had known. It was wrong. The face was too gaunt, the eyes too hollow, sunken deep into a skull that had no warmth, no life left in it. His skin was stretched tight across his bones, sickly pale and mottled with dark veins that looked like bruises, like something that had been long dead but somehow reanimated. His lips curled back into a grimace that almost resembled a smile, but it wasn't Jake's smile. It wasn't human. The mouth, too wide, too jagged, split into a grin that seemed to stretch impossibly across his face, and the teeth, sharp, yellowed, looked more like the fangs of some predatory creature than a man's. Ellie took a step back, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Jake? Is that you?" Her voice broke on the last word, trembling as if she couldn't bring herself to fully say his name, like saying it out loud would make it more real, would confirm what they were all afraid of. The thing in front of them didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if considering her words, and Sarah felt a deep, primal shiver of dread run through her. It was too still, too unmoving, but in its stillness, there was something far worse than motion. It was watching them, no, studying them, like prey. It didn't have the same desperation Jake would have had. No, this was something else. Something other. Whatever had taken him, whatever had dragged Jake's soul into the shadows, was now staring at them through his vacant, hollow eyes. "I don't understand," Ellie whispered, her voice trembling barely above a breath. "What happened to you?" The creature, Jake, stayed silent, unmoving. It was as if his body wasn't his own anymore, like it was just a vessel for something darker, something that was not him. Then, it did something that made Sarah's blood run cold. It smiled again. But this time, it wasn't the jagged, inhuman grin. It was a grin that looked almost familiar. It was the way Jake had smiled when they were friends before the nightmare. But now, the smile was empty. Hollow. There was nothing behind it. And that made it so much worse. "We can't stay here," Sarah said urgently, her voice sharp, as if the words themselves could drive away the creeping dread that was closing in on her. She didn't know how to explain it, didn't know how to make Ellie understand, but she could feel it deep in her gut. The house was feeding on their fear, pulling them deeper into its grasp with every second they stood there. They couldn't afford to stay. Ellie turned toward her, her face a mixture of horror and confusion. "What are we supposed to do?" she whispered. Her eyes darted back to the creature standing motionless in front of them, and Sarah saw the desperation in her friend's face, the realization that they were beyond help. There was nothing they could do for Jake now. Nothing they could do but run. But the moment Sarah turned toward the stairs, the air around them shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight pressure, a sudden coldness that seemed to tighten the space around them, but then it grew. The temperature in the attic dropped even further, and the shadows seemed to stretch, to move, to warp around them. The door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a violent bang, and the sound echoed through the attic, reverberating like a gunshot, shaking the walls. The floor beneath their feet trembled as if the house itself were alive, shifting, reacting to their movements. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. "No, no, no, no," she backed away slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for Sarah. "We're not going anywhere, are we? It's not letting us leave." The realization hit Sarah with the force of a freight train. The house wasn't just a trap. It was the trap. The walls weren't just enclosing them, they were closing in on them. Slowly, steadily, methodically. And whatever was happening to Jake, whatever was consuming him in the attic, was just the beginning. The house was hungry. It was feeding off their fear, growing stronger with each passing moment, with each breath they took. There was no escaping it. No escaping anything in this house. Sarah reached for Ellie, pulling her toward the farthest corner of the attic. "We have to get out of here. We don't have time." But her words fell flat in the thick, oppressive air. The creature, Jake, was still standing in front of them, unmoving, silent, its empty eyes locked on them with a gaze that seemed to pierce straight through their souls. It wasn't just Jake's body anymore. It was something else entirely, something far worse. It was the house itself, the thing that had been watching them from the moment they stepped foot inside. Ellie let out a shaky breath, her hand still clutched around Sarah's. What is it? What's in the attic with us?" Sarah couldn't answer her. She didn't have the words to explain it. All she knew was that they had no time left. The house had made its move. It had already taken one of them, and it wasn't done yet. They were running out of options. Out of time. Without warning, Jake's body, the thing that had once been Jake, shifted, taking a step toward them. It moved unnaturally, like something that didn't belong in the world. It was too smooth, too fluid in its movements. There was no hesitation, no stumbling as a person might make, but something about it, something about the way it walked, felt wrong. It was as though the body was a puppet, its strings pulled by something far more powerful than any human could understand. The air in the attic grew thicker, pressing down on them, suffocating them. Sarah could feel the weight of it on her chest, making every breath harder to take. Her lungs burned as she gasped for air, the temperature so cold that it was hard to even move, hard to even think. "Jake!" Ellie cried out, her voice frantic, but the figure didn't respond. It didn't even acknowledge her, just continued to move toward them, its eyes empty and cold, fixed on them like a predator on its prey. The closer it came, the more Sarah could feel the weight of its presence, the suffocating force it carried. It wasn't just a physical presence, it was something more. It was the house, the darkness, the hunger that had been growing since they arrived. It wasn't Jake. Not anymore. Ellie backed into Sarah, the fear in her eyes mirroring Sarah's own. "We can't stay here," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but the desperation in it was clear. Sarah wanted to agree, wanted to believe they could make it out. But she couldn't. She couldn't let herself think that. Not yet. They weren't safe. Not in the house, not with this thing coming for them. It was too late. Before she could say anything, the figure lunged. Too fast. It was on them in an instant, a blur of motion, and everything became a blur of pain, of darkness. There was no air. No escape. The house had won. Sarah's heart slammed against her chest as the figure lunged toward them. Time seemed to stretch, to fracture, as the thing that had once been Jake moved with a horrifying speed, closing the distance between them in an instant. The air seemed to freeze in that moment, and Sarah felt as if she were stuck in a nightmare, unable to move, unable to scream. The weight of the darkness that surrounded them pressed in on all sides, closing in tighter than ever before. She could feel the cold of it seep into her bones, a chill so deep it left her breathless. The house itself seemed to shift, groaning with the weight of its own hunger, as if it were alive, a living entity bent on consuming them, swallowing them whole. Ellie screamed, the sound high-pitched and desperate, but it was cut off as the figure reached them. There was no warning, no second chance, just a crushing force that knocked the air from Sarah's lungs. The creature, the thing that had once been Jake, was on them, its cold, empty eyes locked on them as it grabbed Ellie with unnatural strength, its fingers digging into her arms. Ellie's body went limp in its grasp, her voice strangled by fear. Sarah's mind was reeling, her thoughts scrambled as she fought to comprehend what was happening, but it all felt surreal. A nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. In a frantic panic, Sarah tried to pull Ellie away, but her hands slipped uselessly against the creature's cold, bony arm. The thing didn't even flinch. It wasn't human anymore. It didn't respond to fear, to pain. It was something otherworldly, something that had no place in the world they knew. And as it pulled Ellie closer, Sarah realized, with sickening clarity, that there was nothing she could do. She was powerless. The figure was too strong. It was too fast. And they were trapped. The walls of the attic seemed to close in around them, the air thick with an invisible force, suffocating them. Ellie's breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as the creature lifted her from the floor, its grip unrelenting. She kicked her legs, thrashing violently, but it was no use. The thing had her in its grasp, and Sarah could see the fear in her friend's eyes, the terror that reflected her own. Ellie's mouth opened to scream again, but the sound was stifled, choked by the grip of the thing. It was as if the house itself had swallowed their voices, leaving them silent in the face of something far more sinister than either of them could comprehend. For a brief moment, Sarah stood paralyzed, her mind too overwhelmed by terror to act. She was watching her friend be taken, and all she could do was stare, her hands trembling, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that it drowned out everything else. The creature's twisted face was inches from Ellie's, its eyes hollow, lifeless, but its expression, if it could even be called that, seemed to be full of malice, of something darker. And then, as if it had sensed her hesitation, the creature turned its head slowly, its gaze locking onto Sarah. She felt the weight of its stare in her gut, like a cold hand pressing down on her insides, and for a split second, she thought she might pass out from the sheer intensity of it. But before she could make sense of what was happening, it moved, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, a crackling sound filling the air as its neck twisted. A movement so jerky and inhuman that it made Sarah's stomach turn. Please, Ellie gasped, her voice a ragged whisper, barely audible over the thundering rush of blood in Sarah's ears. Her eyes were wide with terror, pleading, and that moment of helplessness, the desperate look on her face, cut through Sarah like a knife. But there was no time to comfort her. No time to tell her it would be okay, because Sarah knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be. It couldn't be. The figure's grip tightened on Ellie, and a bone-chilling hiss escaped from its throat. It wasn't a sound that could be made by a human being. It was something far worse, something other. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she felt the floor beneath her feet shift again. The house was groaning, creaking with an unnatural energy, as if it were alive, feeding on the fear that radiated from every corner of the room. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the shadows stretching and bending in ways that weren't natural, as if the darkness itself were warping in response to the creature's presence. The very air was thick with a malevolent force that seemed to smother every part of Sarah's being, leaving her helpless, frozen in place. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't even move. Everything was happening too fast, too violently, and she was powerless to stop it. Her body refused to obey, as if it knew there was no way out, as if it had already accepted that this was the end, that they were trapped. And then, just when it seemed like the creature was about to drag Ellie into the abyss with it, something inside Sarah snapped. The instinct to survive, to fight, rose from the depths of her panic. She couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't let her friend disappear into the darkness. With a surge of adrenaline, she forced herself to move, her legs shaking with the effort as she stumbled forward. She reached for the nearest thing, a broken piece of wood from the attic floor, and swung it with all the strength she had left, aiming for the creature's head. The blow landed, but it didn't have the desired effect. The thing barely flinched, its expression still frozen in that terrible, hollow grin. But Sarah didn't stop. She swung again, and again, each strike fueled by pure desperation, her hands raw and trembling from the impact. But it didn't matter. The creature was stronger, faster. Each time she tried to hit it, it dodged, moving with an unnatural agility that made Sarah's blood run cold. With a horrifying, grating laugh, the creature turned its attention back to Ellie, and that's when Sarah realized the full scope of their nightmare. This wasn't just a haunting. It wasn't just some ghostly presence. This was something alive. Something that had been here, in the very fabric of the house, for far longer than they could imagine. Something that fed on the living. Something that was waiting for them,